Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Aging in Place, How to Make a Home in the City. I'm Pauline Lee with UCSF Family Services, and joining me today is Family Services Director Natalie Larson. We want to give a very warm welcome to our speaker, Stacy Torres, PhD. She's an assistant professor in the UCSF Department of Social Behavioral Sciences School of Nursing. Dr. Torres is an ethnographer who specializes in aging and the life course, gender, family, health, mental health, and urban sociology. Her new book is At Home in the City, Growing Old in Urban America. All attendees of today's webinar will be entered in a drawing to win 1 of 5 copies of Dr. Torres's book. This talk is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be emailed to everyone who signed up, signed up for this event. If you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A and we'll answer them during the last 10 to 15 minutes of this webinar. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Torres.
Thank you so much, Pauline. So I will just share my slides. Fingers crossed this goes all right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending, especially on May Day. I really appreciate your participation and your interest. So I figured before I get started and launching into the content of the book, I'd tell you a little bit about myself and how I found my research participants. So often when I think about my career, I think of that Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime. And there's this line in there where, David Byrne is like, how did I get here? And so sometimes I'm still amazed at where I've been and where hopefully I'm going in the future. So I grew up in New York City, and this is the setting for the book. And I grew up in Manhattan, working class. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And so already I felt like something of a perpetual outsider, even at a young age. I was very shy and socially awkward, on the fringes, looking in. And so I think that that has served me in my work as an ethnographer, as like a professional stalker of sorts, trying to kind of understand people's lives, follow them, of course, with their permission, and immerse myself in different groups. I'm also the daughter of an immigrant from Chile who worked as an elevator operator and a doorman, among many jobs and many hats that he wore, and a mother of a lifelong secretary. And because none of my parents went to college, it really took me a while to see how their gifts set the foundation for my work as an ethnographer. Again, somebody who's observing social life. That's what we do as ethnographers. And my father's powers of observation, he would point out in his words the weird people in New York City that he saw on the streets. But he had many wonderful stories to tell about his interactions with the tenants who lived in the building where he worked. There were actually some famous people. I won't name names, but there were some people who worked on Broadway and television and movies that lived there. And my mother, her lifelong note taking, record keeping, journal writing, her secretarial skills, I feel served me well as well. I have a humanities background, and so I tried to draw on that in writing this book as engaging as I could, I guess, for an academic study. And I studied comparative literature in college, and afterwards I earned an MFA in creative nonfiction writing at Columbia University. And so I really in that experience was working on a memoir and really tried to understand my own experience before I proceeded to try to understand the experiences of other people. So storytelling and literature has really been my entree into the social world. And so, how I found my subjects, I never intended to study older people. Really, what fascinated me at first was that the place where my study began, this mom and pop bakery in New York City, had somehow survived gentrification. And so, as a lifelong New Yorker, I was shocked when I found that this bakery I call La Marjolaine in the book was even still in business. It had been around since 1962 or so, which was ancient by New York standards. It was like this dinosaur. And this place, almost preserved in amber, sat nestled among 3 residential swaths. We had public housing projects, low equity co-ops that were built in the 60s, and market rate apartment buildings that still housed a sizable number of rent controlled and rent stabilized tenants. And so this place, this bakery, was, again, this mom and pop bakery had 8 tables, so modest sized, arranged in a rectangle. And this really allowed this layout people to dip in and out of a number of simultaneous conversations going on around them. The butter-colored walls and the worn plastic tablecloths lent the place a cozy, if maybe a little bit distressed ambiance. People would joke about like some holes in the tablecloth or the rickety chairs, but they did this affectionately and they still came every day. And they would drop in several times a week, sometimes every day, multiple times a day, even. And a few didn't even buy anything. They would just come to this place and use it as a hangout spot. But soon I started noticing the people more, and the place was not only old, but filled with older New Yorkers. So men and women over the age of 60, but largely in their 70s and 80s. And they were aging in place. And this term basically means that unlike some of their counterparts who had retired, many to Florida, or whose health declined to the point where they had to move into an assisted living facility or a nursing home, these older New Yorkers were attempting and managing to stay in their homes and their communities for as long as possible. And many had lived in the neighborhood several decades, and in some cases, their entire lives. So they preferred this type of a space to, let's say, a senior center, an institutional space that would serve older people. And it provided them really with an important venue where they could develop the kind of social ties and social support that helped them age in place and remain in their homes. And so from this site, I would recruit the elders that I'd spend the next 5 years conducting participant observations amongst. So we started at the bakery, and then the study and me ended up in other places when the bakery closed due to gentrification and a lost lease. The rent was going way up, and the owner couldn't afford to get a new lease. And so the older people had to find new places to gather. And so, to give you a peek into that last day at the bakery, that last day of business, I'm going to read a short passage from the opening pages. We huddled at a corner table on the final day at La Marjolaine Patisserie, a mom and pop bakery on Manhattan's West Side. As snow curtained the windows and icy February air tore through each time the door opened, heavy flakes fell, and a little more of the place disappeared. A depleted stock of cakes and baked goods greeted customers. Sooty edges demarcated the ghostly outlines of pastry display cases that had sat for years on otherwise bright floor tile. The butter-colored walls stood bare but for a leftover Valentine's Day wreath cradling 2 fuzzy teddy bears beneath a banner that read, "I love you." With a mischievous glint in his eyes, the owner said that he would leave it for the landlord. He had lost his lease after the landlord had sought a much higher monthly rent, and renewal negotiations had broken down that autumn. But despite everything, he hadn't lost his sense of humor about the bitter fight to keep his store open. Buyers for the equipment stripped the kitchen clean, and burly men soon arrived to remove commercial mixers and industrial ovens. Weighing over 1,000 pounds, they had been planted in the same spot for decades. I felt a twinge of disbelief as movers dismantled a place almost frozen in time, which until a few days before had seemed as enduring as the hulking trunk of a giant redwood tree or the base of the Empire State Building. Under ordinary circumstances, most people would have stayed home. Snowy sludge slicked the sidewalks, and many elder customers couldn't risk a fall. But neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night kept most regulars away on the bakery's last day of business. I saw many familiar faces, people I had met since becoming a customer 6 years before. Eugene sat in the corner. Though he'd, prov- though he'd proven stalwart on numerous occasions and had recently recovered from a second major hip surgery, his appearance still surprised me. Another longtime customer, Carmen, turned up despite a bad cold. I had to come for the last day, she said, brushing snow from her shoulders and shaking off her black hat encrusted with ice. Red-nosed and sniffling, she clutched a balled-up tissue. Rather than trudge 2.5 blocks home, she took a cab back. Sylvia appeared at her usual time, around 10 a.m., and Lucy followed in the early afternoon. So again, just to give a brief overview, though it may seem a little bit obvious since you've already read the description and signed up for this webinar of the book. Um, the book really looks at older adults and how they're aging in place in this Manhattan neighborhood in New York City. And I really tried to understand and share with you how they maintained independence. And I put that in quotes because it's really interdependent. They're completely not independent in the sense that they didn't need help from anyone, but how they maintain this independence in the face of accumulated loss, gentrification, health setbacks, depression, financial struggle, and everyday challenges. These are just some of the things that they were facing in late life. And the book seeks to understand how social support and belonging to place and to others, which may include family, friends, neighbors, and everybody in between. So, for our time together today, I've organized my remarks around some sometimes counterintuitive ways that people made a home in the city. So, some of the guiding questions that the book looks at are the following. We know that belonging matters for older adults, but less about how, why, and what facilitates it. How do older people maintain their independence when faced with multiple vulnerabilities? What forms of social relationships exist? How do older people create or sometimes resist belonging? And in what ways does belonging to a place or a group of people help manage crises and other everyday challenges? And in this book, I argue that we should really devote greater attention to the neighborhood context where informal social connections blossom, and that they're really important for older adults. Given the need not to overburden family networks, assuming that people have them, and given the surplus time for those who have the privilege of retiring, they're not having to continue to work and spending more time at home. That was really a challenge I found that people needed anchoring relationships to help and routines to help fill that time. And so relationships like the ones that I observed cultivated in public places may also allow older adults greater standing and recognition as something other than cultural stereotypes, which can be quite negative about them being dependent or invisible or a problem to solve. And so I argue that alternative social ties stand alongside and in some cases rival other structures which are critical to well-being in old age, such as family and home. So often in the research, in social science research, health research, isolation is really portrayed as a problem of old age. And, this is due to a number of factors, risk factors, including older adults who live alone, maybe experiencing more physical illness, and depression increases the isolation risk. But networks also shrink in late life due to some selective paring down that might happen, as well as shifts, including moving to a retirement community or a assisted living facility, or the transition to retirement that can diminish work contacts. And so, but despite these challenges, I want to point out that the prevalence of isolation among the old really does remain unclear. And there are many people that are able to be connected, or even if they are spending a lot of time in solitude, do not feel lonely. And so, research has also found that older people face less loneliness and isolation than previously thought, and that social interaction and volunteering can increase with age and be helpful to combating that sense of loneliness that can be so debilitating. So place really matters, and place can rise in significance for older people who spend more time closer to home due to retirement, due to dwindling finances. It's expensive to travel, and health problems that limit travel and may limit mobility, and the ability to even walk, farther distances. Um, but there are opportunities for connection in third spaces. And so, as older adults become less entrenched in institutions of work and family, they must find ways to craft new routines and relationships. And third places offer important opportunities for them to socialize and to do that. Um, Elders' interactions in places such as fast food restaurants, shopping malls, public parks may also offer one of few opportunities for social contact outside more formal settings where they receive services. So, like a doctor's office or a senior center. And so they have the opportunity to kind of refashion their identity and be seen in a different light. And so, for people with vulnerabilities stemming from a lack of, let's say, strong family support, lacking material resources, experiencing cognitive and physical declines, I found in this study with this group of people that neighborhood places really served as important locations to alleviate the isolation that they experienced in other parts of their life. So just a quick overview of the research that I did. This was a 5-year study in which I did mostly participant observation. So I would spend, several hours with people every day, observing their interactions, participating as well. And I supplemented that also with 25 interviews. And the people that participated in the study, what we would call the sample, had a number of characteristics, but I'll point out these, which were really, I think, key. So the study, even though there were many more people that I observed, let's say in the course of a day, really focused around a roughly 47, a group of 47 men and women over the age of 60, more women than men, as we would expect in late life. They were largely from a racial and ethnic makeup, Puerto Rican, Jewish, ethnic white, so Italian, Greek, and Irish American. They were lower to middle income, most of them, and they were reflecting the demographics of the neighborhood prior to gentrification. One other feature of the neighborhood I would like to point out is that many of them lived in buildings called NORCs, which stands for Naturally Occurring Retirement Community. And basically, that means that there was a concentration of older people in the housing in this area. And that did facilitate more social service provision in these buildings at times. So just to give you a little bit of a glimpse into the sites where I spent so much time, this is the bakery, which I call La Marjolaine, but everybody used to just call the bakery. And you'll see, it's just kind of a basic mom and pop, not too many frills in this place, but comfy. And then when La Marjolaine closed, people ended up going to McDonald's. And one of the things that was really fascinating, which I don't have a lot of time to go into, but there were some rules in McDonald's and kind of prohibitions against loitering, but people did spend a lot of time there. And finally, there was a little deli where people congregated, which just had a few tables jammed up in the front. And I call this place Pete's Deli. And so that was somewhere where people gathered when their original site closed down. So, as I mentioned, the rest of my remarks are going to walk us through the sometimes counterintuitive ways that older people in my study, made a home in the city. So one of the things, and I kind of have these titles set up in jest that they would maybe suggest, or I would suggest, is loiter, and which means find your public living room, go to places, hang out, spend a lot of time there. And so conditions that facilitate, access to these places and frequent interaction where you can build relationships, I found were cost, having a lower cost of items that people could buy to provide entry to more people was important. Time, that you could spend a lot of time in a place. The location and proximity was very important to people in my study, as some of them were having trouble even walking a block or two. But because this is New York City and it's a bit of an outlier in its density, people were really fortunate to be able to continue to walk to neighborhood business. And surveillance was something that they had to keep in mind. And so people really disliked the feeling if they were being, watched or they were being monitored. They really wanted to feel free in these spaces. Um, Eavesdropping and people watching, being nosy and inserting yourself into conversations is really a key part of kind of loitering in a way and finding your hangout spot that facilitates the development of some deeper ties at time. And finally, sharing information and gathering intelligence or intel, as I put it in the slide, was a key part of the way that people You not only gathered information on other people, but shared information and shared resources that became really important when somebody needed help. So another thing that I found that reminded me of that old Groucho Marx joke, I don't want to belong to any club that would accept me as one of the members, was one of its members, was that the older people that I spent time with, they weren't shut-ins and they were definitely going out and trying to avoid isolation. But for the most part, these people were not the joiners. They were not in book clubs, they were not in knitting circles, they were not senior center goers, and they weren't heavily involved in spiritual spaces. And so, it reminded me of some of the reasons I tried to understand why became apparent when I thought about age as a social identity and as a dimension of our social lives. And in sociology, but in other disciplines as well, age is really treated as an et cetera category. It's like people primarily think about like race, class, gender as being these primary identities, and age is kind of, in the et cetera category. But it's really important for structuring a number of things in our society, from our access to benefits to when we start school. That's really important. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to get into in this talk. But being old is a stigmatized identity. And so a lot of people did not claim age as their primary identity. Sometimes they would make jokes, like, oh, there was this one woman, she would say, oh, I don't want to go to McDonald's because the dementia club hangs out there. There was another older adult who was a working writer all the way up until he passed away at about age 93. And, he would explain he didn't want to go to a senior center because he hates old people. I hate old people. He said, I don't want to play mahjong and all of that. And so there was a lot of internalized and externalized ageism as well. And but when the bakery started to close, people really recognized it as a place that they needed because they were older and they had these different challenges. And so they were calling themselves the Bakery Club at the end. So they had kind of coalesced for a moment. And I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but there's a philosopher named Iris Marion Young, and she was thinking about aging, or she was thinking about groups in general as being maybe a series is the way to think about it, like a group that comes together for a moment and then disperses when a crisis or a situation has abated. And so I was thinking too about aging as maybe being a series, like a time limited group. I think right now we're in a moment where a lot of older adults are thinking about their age and retirement, given the stock market and the 401ks losing so much value, and questions about what's going to happen with Social Security in the future. And so that might be, a catalyzing moment in which people come together on the basis of age, but then they may, kind of disperse. So another kind of tip that older people, I guess, taught me in terms of thinking about how to make relationships that are satisfying and supporting, but also not too burdening. I would recommend get closer, but not too close. And so, a lot of older adults here did not want to call each other friends. And this led me to conceptualize their relationships as being this other category of relationship that I call elastic ties. And so, they would know a lot about each other, but they really wouldn't call each other friends. And so this discrepancy between the interactions I observed and participants' reports of their relationships, people who appeared close, but they would not own that label, it posed a puzzle for me. And so I turned to the literature on social networks and social relationships. And basically, in sociology, there's a landmark paper about the strength of weak ties by this sociologist named Mark Granovetter. And he conceptualized strong ties as being ties where there's intimacy and the sense of mutual confiding. A lot of people are spending a lot of time together. They're sharing things, they're giving gifts. There's some reciprocity at play, and there's a sense of emotional intensity, emotional connection. And so I saw a lot of the interactions that I observed among older people as fulfilling the criteria for these close relationships. But then I also noticed this distance coexisting. In a single interaction, there could be closeness, and then people would distance themselves, or in a social tie. And so, like a rubber band, I call these elastic ties, and I sort of thought about them as like, okay, a rubber band stretches to accommodate fluidity and the spontaneity of social relations, and it can kind of, bend and pull according to changing needs and routines in late life. And so that's how I conceptualize these relationships as being somewhere, kind of a third way that combines some of this closeness and some of this distance. And so I was going to read a passage to illustrate this, but I think I will continue on because the time is going by quickly. But elastic ties is I really feel kind of the bedrock of relationships that I observed in this space. So another thing that people did that was surprising to me at first, but it probably shouldn't have been, was they gossiped a lot about each other. And I saw gossip. At first, I was very surprised to see this because I guess I had kind of a one-dimensional kind of rosy view of the relationships there. And so when I spent more time and heard about how people were talking about each other, sometimes it was neutral. It was just they observed something, they would share information, and sometimes it was quite negative. It kind of shook me, and I had to think about this. And I delved into the literature and other research on gossip, and I came to see their form of gossip as really being a kind of social glue that held them together and kept them immersed in the site. And so gossip is really defined as talk in the absence of a third party of discussion. So there's some third person that people are talking about that is not present for that discussion. Gossip has been found to provide fulfill a number of functions in terms of providing information. Gossip has allowed other people to wield influence over other people. The person that has the gossip has this secret information, may be elevated in stature. Uh, Gossip can serve as a form of entertainment. It can provide group cohesion and closeness. It can also provide people with an opportunity to kind of measure their own standing through a social comparison, comparing themselves to other people and evaluating themselves and kind of where they stand when they're hearing the gossip about all the other people. And so basically, you don't want to be probably the big topic of discussion necessarily. That may indicate that you've fallen to the bottom of the hierarchy. And in this study, I found a lot of those purposes filled. But really, the ones that stood out to me were this gossip serving as a conduit for connection and intimacy, entertainment and storytelling. It allowed people to blow off steam and vent when they need to. At times, it could create hierarchy. And it also was really important way for people to share information. And so I'll just sort of paraphrase a little bit. One of these vignettes that I observed focused on a woman named Teresa, and she had dementia. And I think this vignette highlights multiple themes. She became more and more a recurrent uh, figure of discussion and sometimes ridicule. And so talking about this woman, Teresa, allowed her peers to joke at her expense, and thus they entertained themselves and invoked humor and storytelling. This form of gossip helped delineate a local hierarchy that assured that those who participated, those that were talking about this woman who had dementia, had not fallen to the bottom of the social hierarchy where she was because she received so much negative attention. But over time, I came to see the way that people talked about this woman, Teresa, as more complicated than simply laughing at her, disparaging. Others talked about her, but they also kept track of her and looked out for her as her dementia worsened to the point where she could no longer live on her own, and she had to move closer to family in New Jersey. Many expressed frustration with her for several reasons beyond her cognitive problems, but they never cast her out and they continued to accommodate her participation in interactions. And so when she moved, they made repeated efforts to help contact her, despite problems getting in touch with her brother. And so I really saw Teresa's story as an example of somebody whose involvement with neighborhood people over several years of decline may have actually prevented her from losing her independence earlier. So the next takeaway, I guess, that I took away from the study was about kind of complaining and commiserating with each other. And people did, again, they did a lot of talking in these spaces. And a lot of their conversations really revolved around griping about their aches and pains. They were calling out ageism and the poor treatment that they had experienced in healthcare interactions. And it was a really important space for them to be able to express, how they felt mistreated when they went to the doctor, which was a place that serves a lot of older people. And so using third spaces to process, moments of dissatisfaction and demoralizing experiences in these elder serving spaces was really an important way that people took care of themselves, and also to process what their healthcare providers were telling them. A lot of times it was almost like getting, again, a second, a third, a fourth opinion. They would consult people there, go through their healthcare decisions, and then other people would weigh in with experiences that they had had. And so I think many of us can relate, when we're going through a health crisis or trying to help a family member with a health crisis, you can get information overload. And so sometimes they would share, hey, I had this problem getting this medication and I fixed it this way. Or, oh, I actually have a really good primary care doctor, called them. And so it was a really important clearinghouse of information. Um, Again, though, people had internalized a lot of ageism and age stigma in settings where people were separated by age. Including senior centers, they disliked socializing only with older people. And so this was a really important place where they could spend a lot of time with older people, but not necessarily feel like they were, excluded from intergenerational contact. And the likelihood of negative interactions in the healthcare system permeated with ageism was really affecting them. The more that you go to the doctor, you're an older person, there is ageism, the higher chances you have of having one of these really difficult experiences. So I will read a passage from the book, showcasing a vignette that I feel highlights this dissatisfaction and resignation experienced by two of the core participants named Sylvia and Eugene. So I will just grab that. Managing the body often involved talking about it, and almost every conversation contained on-ramps to discussing the body and health. Visits to healthcare sites loomed large in most people's lives, especially those with multiple chronic illnesses. Some received primary care at one of two clinics located a few blocks from their homes, including one devoted to geriatric medicine. But many also traveled outside of the neighborhood, especially for specialized medical care. When someone gave a play-by-play account after returning from an appointment, regulars often joined in the post-game analysis. These interactions provided a chance to vent their own frustrations and compare health problems. After Eugene returned from the Veterans Affairs Hospital's geriatric clinic, along with medical updates, he always came armed with stories of how the staff had condescended to him. His accounts gave people the opportunity to opine about his treatment and share their experiences. He voiced his distaste for the protocol that staff followed to assess his physical status and mental acuity. They asked him if he could tell them the day of the week and to explain how he traveled to the clinic on his own. Once they took their assessment further. They removed Eugene's shoes and asked him to demonstrate that he could put them back on without assistance. Afterwards, Eugene wrote a complaint letter to the VA hospital director and received a written apology. When I go to the doctor, it's always the same thing. What day is it? Here are three objects: an apple, a dog, an airplane, Eugene imitated in a sing-song falsetto. Then they walk away and quiz you later. Do you know how many times I've drawn a clock with its hands at 10 of 12? Oh, yes, I hate that one. When they leave you sitting there and they walk away, Sylvia said of the first cognitive assessment. Uh-huh. And what if you forget one of those things? What then? She shuddered. And the other one, where they write the letters, that's a tough one. She described another of these tests, her pejorative term, in which a doctor instructed her to close her eyes while he traced an alphabet letter on her open palm, then asked her to identify the mystery letter. What was here, like this, she said, when I asked her to demonstrate. She traced the outline of an alphabet letter on my open palm while I kept my eyes closed. I flunked, unable to identify the mystery letter. What was it? I asked. Q. Well, here's the deal, Eugene continued. What I don't understand is, if they want to make sure I'm not senile, why don't they discuss current events with me? Ask me what's going on in the world, or if I've read the newspaper. I'm the author of over 50 books. Sylvia confessed that these tests made her nervous and that she also hated them. But what choice do I have? They need to check for certain things, she said, knocking on the table to ward off ill fortune and looking up at the ceiling or to a God she admitted doubting existed. Eugene rolled his eyes. Well, I don't have to take it, he said, raking his fingers under his chin and flicking them in a favorite defiant gesture, which he directed at reckless taxi drivers, condescending medical personnel, and anyone else who disrespected him or pissed him off. I don't like to make waves, Sylvia cautioned. She invoked the same phrase when talking about her building management, another entity that could jeopardize her physical and emotional security if rocked the wrong way. She was a vocal proponent of following a doctor's orders rather, even when skeptical of the message. She also encountered ageism during medical appointments and claimed that elders received dismissive treatment, quote, when they see that number on the form, when you get above a certain number. And so again, people had a myriad, they had myriad encounters with healthcare providers, some which were very supportive and some which they felt demoralizing. But I think this was really important. And, at times Eugene would end up avoiding the doctors to the point where he couldn't get refills on his heart medication. And so there were really real consequences to the way that people did not feel comfortable in some of these spaces. And so I'd like to share some of the main takeaways and implications of my work that I'm hoping that we can think about together as we are continuing to try to figure out how to support the older people in our lives and how to support ourselves as we all get older. And I'm certainly thinking about this. I'm 45, but thinking about a future in which I want to take care of myself. I want to thrive. I want to figure out how to live, in a place that nurtures my soul, and also I can afford and can live as I may develop, more disabilities. And so some of the takeaways that I found were, home is really more than just four walls. It's more than just the houses that we live in and the apartments that we occupy. And third places provide crucial space for social support as an extension of that home, especially for those facing multiple vulnerabilities and in light of increasing diversity and shifting demographics in terms of us spending more time, again, aging, having many, many decades, maybe for some of us who are privileged enough to live until our 90s post-retirement, and may have different kinds of relationships, may have multiple romantic relationships, may never get married or have children. So I think that it's really important to think about home as being larger than just, one small physical space. Ties outside of weak and strong, and so the kind of elastic ties that I observed are also an under-recognized and potentially untapped form of support. And so they offer a way to negotiate these competing needs for connection and autonomy. And finally, I think about this metaphor that I try to draw out in the book of an inevitable place, that where we're all going to arrive if we live long enough at some inevitable place in the life course. And so this can be a temporal place, we live long enough, we spend a number of years on this earth, and then we arrive in our late life. It could be a physical place in terms of the places where these older adults found themselves. Sometimes they were stuck in place. They didn't have many places to go, along with aging in place. This could be a cognitive place that we come to, sort of an emotional feeling realm, kind of a sense of arriving at a different place in our lives. But few are prepared, and too many administrative burdens, meaning hurdles to accessing care at times, to accessing home care or health care or other services, are really too high and need to be mitigated. Again, these things are difficult at any age to deal with, but especially when you're older and you're dealing with a number of other problems, it's really difficult. And so that's, kind of thinking about these administrative burdens. An example could be something that I'm really concerned about with all the cuts in Social Security offices, and just difficulties applying or accessing benefits, or even talking to somebody on the phone when you come up across a problem. And so if I had a magic wand, I would make a few key recommendations. And this is not an exhaustive list. I would like to have many more recommendations. But I think these are some important takeaways that we can think of, at least sort of a starting point. So social infrastructure and strengthening it, I think, is really key. And by social infrastructure, I mean those third places, parks, libraries, these kind of public square type opportunities for engaging in interaction and getting to know our neighbors and supporting our neighbors. I think this is really important. And so this can look like investing in our small businesses and public spaces, our green spaces. It can also mean fighting commercial eviction to ease the pain of the social eviction of longtime residents. And so social eviction is a metaphor that I use to describe the ways that people felt that even if they weren't being evicted from their apartments and their homes, that they felt socially ostracized as the neighborhood changed, places closed, they couldn't afford them, or even if they could afford them, they didn't always feel comfortable. They didn't feel that those places really, that they were the valued customer, that they had been open for another group, and so they felt merely tolerated. I think a substantial investment in affordable, accessible, safe, climate resistant, more increasingly supportive housing for older adults and people of all ages, incomes, and abilities is something that's crucial. If you don't have a secure roof over your head, somewhere where you feel safe, somewhere that is safer from all of the climate change that we are experiencing, and not only later in life, but early in life. In my study, a lot of these people had been living in their homes for decades, which means that they were able to access this affordable housing much earlier in life. And this was really important and something that is, fast disappearing. And finally, solving the long-term care crisis, which means bolstering a range of supports in the communities for people, boosting our care infrastructure, and support for paid and unpaid care workers. And so paid care workers, it's just, people who provide home health care are always disadvantaged and not provided the living wage for this very important work that they need and deserve. And we're having a shortage of home care workers, understandably, because this is very hard work and needs to be properly compensated. And also unpaid care workers, meaning family and informal caregivers, which are so important and overburdened. So I'll pause here or stop here. I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. And I would be remiss, I'm not much the promoter, but I did put this last slide in this talk for you all in case you're interested in learning more about the book. This is the cover of the book I'm very proud of because I put some input and they did a wonderful job and kind of, I think, evoking the ethos. But it's available many different online retailers, including Amazon. But if you're interested, you can go directly directly to UC Press. And actually, you can save 30% at UC Press with this coupon code. So I'll stop that here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. That was wonderful. Really, really insightful. So we did have one question that came through the chat. I can read it to you. Recognizing that New York City is unique in its density and walkability, have you seen similar third places that coalesce communities of the elderly in other cities or even in suburbs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think the interesting thing is, no, I cannot sort of generalize this small study to so many other places, but I think the wanting and the need for these spaces is really important, and not just for older people, but for people of all ages. And so just anecdotally, years ago, I had a New York Times op-ed about my research and about how older people were hanging out at McDonald's. And I got so many fascinating letters from around the country, emails, and from people who were in rural areas as well. And so they were saying, like, there was this one farmer who would say, "Oh, I would get together with these other people at like the local McDonald's. And yeah, we would have to drive and go there, but it was really important to have like their morning, like, coffee clutch or meeting, at this place." I think, post offices are really, really important in areas that are more dispersed. And so post offices, or even something like a local, like a country store, like a grocery store, can be really important. I think parks are really important. I mean, this is not about older adults necessarily, but recently I stayed with one of my students outside of Boston. And so she lives in this area, Belmont. It's a little bit more suburban-y and like small town like. And she was saying how much they relied on just having this park. She's met so many parents, which can be another time in life where people are really kind of feeling strained and maybe isolated. And so just having these park friendships were really important. Even though she didn't even know, we had a great conversation with somebody. She didn't even know the person's first name, but she knows the daughter, they play and all of that stuff. So I think if we think about our communities, there are many different opportunities for these third spaces, community centers, and churches as well. Churches, spiritual spaces, churches, mosques, synagogues, the whole gambit. One thing I would like to mention that I think is really important, especially when it's a more dispersed area, is strengthening our public transportation. One thing that people didn't have to face here that is really very difficult for people who are living in a more car-dependent area is when you cannot drive as an older person anymore, you are really losing a lot of independence. And so I think having safe, reliable public transportation in many different areas is really crucial so people have an option.
Thank you. Let's see, another question, both for myself and for aging parents, what would be different for San Francisco living if you are living more away from services and needs like third spaces? How do you balance this livelihood?
So what would be different? Was that you cut out for a minute.
Sorry, yeah,
Okay, great.
yes.
So I think again, third spaces are just one of many spaces where we interact. And I do not mean to suggest that they can like solve everything. No one space can solve everything. And so I think one of the things to kind of look out for. I'm a big fan of social workers and, hospital social workers that work in different settings. And also there's a range of nonprofits that provide a lot of important services, and senior centers as well provide a lot of vital services. And so I would say if you're in an area that is a little bit more remote, and maybe you're living at like the top of a hill that was working better when you were like 35 and now it's more difficult. I think tapping into that network of support is really important. And again, maybe there is some sort of, activity or some kind of gathering opportunity that you're not aware of, or some service. I mean, it's really a tough time for service providers. But services like Meals on Wheels and different kind of meal delivery services that are provided to older adults and people with disabilities and people who are homebound, I think are really important. And so I think one thing I would say too is that a lot of people often who did not need help before, maybe very hesitant to ask for what's available, or there may be a little bit of hesitance or sometimes shame or stigma to kind of tapping into services that maybe you never really thought you needed before. And so that's something that I would just recommend is like if there is a hospital social worker or if there is even like the library. I mean, I'm on like a number of different library listservs, like for Berkeley. I'm out in Oakland here, but San Francisco, all sorts of stuff. And there are so many different activities. And so if you can get to a library, that's a third space. And you may, again, whether it's a knitting circle or a Tai Chi demonstration or something, there are really wonderful services that we can take advantage of that are low cost or free.
Thank you, Stacy. So this one is more of a comment, but would love to hear your point of view. The book and anecdotes are great, and this person is a former sociology major, but it's also hugely depressing given the climate of removing all safety nets and devaluing the needs and concerns of lower income people.
I'm not quite sure I understand the comment. Am I devaluing the needs and concerns?
No, it sounds like the book and the anecdotes
Oh, it's
were
just
really well
hard
written.
to, it's a
Yeah,
kind of a hard
that's
environment.
hard.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
here's what I would say. And again, I didn't have the opportunity to read more because I wanted to be mindful of respectful of time. I would say that this book, even though look, it's very difficult to deal with a lot of these things in late life and difficult at different ages and difficult with the sort of kind of more and more austerity, measures that we're having to face. But I would say that the spirit of the book is not, I would say, not a depressing one. People laughed, people joked, people went out, as much as they could every day. Like one of my participants said, no matter how depressed I am, I'm going to get out of bed and put my lipstick on and go out there. And so I guess that's the one of the things that I would like to highlight is that not that this is necessarily meant to be inspiring, but over time I was really inspired. And even though many people are, they've passed away, most of the people now in the study, they continue to enrich my perspective in my life. And I think about again, their jokes and their the kind of just humor and affection that they had for each other and for me. So that's, I guess, what I would want to highlight is that, we all have to kind of keep calm and carry on in very difficult times, but people find ways to, joke and survive and that's why, commiserate with each other. So I guess I would like to shine a light on that for everyone sort of going through it right now.
Terrific. Well, another question. Were the majority of the people in your study single? I'm wondering how the interactions with other people are different if you still have a spouse. Um, Related, did your subjects also have interactions with friends and family in addition to the kind of this third place that they went to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say the majority of people at this point were single, whether it was because they were widowed or divorced. There were probably more for New York City than other areas, but it could also go for San Francisco. There were a few people that had never been married. So I think, in terms of the people that had a spouse, and there were some people, like there was a couple, and they what the husband in the team had really advancing dementia, and him and his wife would come in daily, and she was taking care of a lot of him without the help of with paid care workers. She did have family, but in the end, she was really worn down physically herself by taking care of him. He eventually went to a nursing home. And so I would say, in terms of those interactions, she was able to interact with people and have a kind of a respite from some of this really heavy caregiving, but she also had to tend to her husband. And so sometimes her interactions might have been curtailed. They also didn't have as much time. I would mention too, there was another person, she was single, but she was taking care of two children, adult children, who had multiple sclerosis and they were wheelchair bound and they actually predeceased her. And so she would come in, it would give her a little bit of respite, but she was running around a lot. I saw some comments just briefly comment. I didn't see the full thing, but about people hanging out. I did see that story about the Embarcadero Starbucks, and it reminded me a lot of what had gone on with this study. I don't know what the outcome was recently. I saw something somewhere in January someone sent me, and I lived in the Richmond for a little while, and I love all those coffee shops, and I would hang out with the older people there too. I write about it in the book a little bit, and I write about I had this older adult, basically like in his 70s, roommate from Dublin, Ireland originally. And he was a retired taxi driver. He would play the piano in the morning. And anyway, I have very fond memories of the Richmond. And I try to get out there whenever I can and go to like the Royal Ground Cafe and Bazaar Cafe. And I thank all of these places in the book because they provided me with a place to write. So thank you for those comments.
Yeah, those came through and thought it was important to share. I think, let's see, and I know we're nearly up at time, so whatever doesn't get answered, we can definitely pass on to Stacy, and you could help us answer those. But thank you for your work and sharing. How do you think the generational differences impact the continuation and building of third space communities?
Could you read that one more time? Sorry,
Sure. Yeah. So, how do you think the generational differences
Hmm.
impact the continuation and building of third space communities?
So I would say, I attended a Stanford Longevity Center conference, which was really wonderful. They have it every year, and I'm going to channel the wisdom of one of the presenters there. I'm blanking on her name, but she's in Singapore and she's from Japan originally, and she's actually an architecture professor in a medical school. And she was saying, it's not enough just to have like a preschool next to a senior center if you want to kind of create intergenerational bonds and like these third spaces where there's more kind of exchange, that you really have to be intentional about it. And so I think I really like opportunities where people have across ages the opportunity to interact, where it's not necessarily like an older person is providing a service to a younger person, or a younger person is like, I don't know, doing like some school study, interviewing an older person. I think those things can be great, but I really like those opportunities that people have to come together on more equal footing. And so I think, again, we have to continue to be intentional about developing these. I just talked to an NYU journalism student yesterday who's profiling this like kind of thing called School of Rock, where like people of all ages can come together and play music, and then they like put on a show. And he was saying, yeah, it's like the youngest person in this group is like 22 years old, and the older person is like 64. And I thought, well, that's a great example of, again, of bringing people together on equal footing, and there's some exchange going on, but it's not necessarily like something's flowing down or up, and people are feeling like they're kind of a burden or not really respected. So I guess that's what I would say about that.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think we're right at time. I think there's one or two questions that haven't been answered, which we could definitely pass on to you. But again, Stacy, thank you so much for your incredible insights and for sharing your wonderful research with. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your amazing insights of your book and lifting the voice and lived experiences of these elders, their challenges and sense of belonging and social relationships. I learned a lot, and also made me think a lot. And I also want to thank Dorothy Wang from our UCSF ETS department, who provided invaluable support. And a huge thank you to all of you who joined us today. And I hope everyone has a terrific afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.